spoken about some issues that we want to work on. Just for the record, Mr. Chairman, we are crafting a fentanyl bill that we hope will draw bipartisan support, and we'll be happy to share it with this committee and the committees that I'm working with, along with the ranking member. To the witnesses, let me thank you for the sacrifice that you've made to even be here today. If we didn't have the opportunity to speak to the American people, we would not have the opportunity to be guided by the American people because we are public servants. I certainly want to say to Mrs. Kiessling, and I hope I'm with adequate pronunciation, that you have my deepest sympathy to have the loss and to experience what you've experienced. And we make a promise here, as I've done sitting on this committee, that we will put you first and we will find every solution that we can to keep dangerous criminals, but also to ensure the protection of the American people. So my deepest sympathy to you, and I thank you. Your story is needed in this room today. I also want to thank Sheriff Lamb for certainly representing law enforcement across America. We all have law enforcement in our communities, and I can assure you they are our neighbors as well as our protectors. I just came back from the border briefly with a senatorial delegation and talked to the men and women at CBP, stood by, as in fact walked to the point of demarcation between the United States and Mexico, watched individuals with day passes, I'll just use that as a parochial term, coming legally across, but at the same time watching canines and also being shown a small vehicle driven by an American young woman, unfortunately, that was loaded down with drugs, I think in this instance, marijuana. The CBP felt very comfortable with their ability to detect and to find the amount of drugs coming through the legal points of entry. My concern was this young woman, 19 now, has got a life ruined. They even said to me she probably got $100. I'm hoping not. I'm just stunned that she was not in college or somewhere else that would have been more productive. But I think it sets the narrative that is actually the facts of what we need to deal with in keeping the borders safe. And we know that we have a very extensive border. What you see in San Diego, you may not see in Yuma, you may not see in El Paso, you may not see in Brownsville, Laredo, and otherwise. So I want to indicate that, first of all, the app is working. Not out of my speculative lips, if you will, but out of experts that are at the board. It is working. It is challenging. You have to have the languages. You have to make sure people have access to it, are in places where they can actually connect. But our teams have set up individuals handling the apps. More resources are needed for those handling the apps and receiving the information. But that process seems to have some merit. So I see this has Secretary Mayorkas in here, and let me compliment the Secretary for being an immigrant and rising from his meager beginnings and serving us with great passion and assertiveness and firmness about securing the American border. I want to go to you, Dr. Byers. Our colleague, Congressman Ivey, offered a wonderful array of support that we gave to the system of immigration. $1.88 billion that Democrats did. And I remember about 2004, I offered and worked with then Senator Kerry for a major contribution. So I only have about 10 seconds left. Let me ask you about the Democrats' approach, but more importantly, that one question about our migrant mothers and children bringing over drugs to make us unsafe, or is there another scheme that is being used to bring over those drugs? I'll yield to you.
Right. Asylum seekers are not bringing drugs. They're the ones we heard about who turn themselves in, who request asylum. You're talking about the ones who are waiting at ports of entry to be able to use a phone app in order to apply for asylum. They're not bringing drugs either. We need a process for them to free up law enforcement resources to interdict people who are coming to do harm.
Do you believe that this process that Governor Abbott is using, $4 billion and putting the National Guard at the border, is enhancing any great safety in that particular small area? Would you just give a general assessment on that?
We'll allow 30 seconds. And
Mr. Chairman, you're very gracious. I'm sorry, I read the clock wrong. I'm so sorry.
30 seconds.
So sorry.
Look, very, very quickly, I think ultimately what the Texas governor has to deal with is very difficult situation, but we are seeing a lot of people being arrested for very minor crimes and being locked up. They're not getting into the immigration process as they should and are entitled to under our laws.
I thank the gentleman. I thank the chairman.
For an academic curriculum for our military DOD schools that's based on the life of Martin Luther King. I appreciate your partnership in that. I now recognize Mr. LaLota from New York.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to say thanks to our witnesses for being here, especially to you, Ms. Kiessling, for having the courage to share your story. I'm the father of 3 wonderful daughters, and I couldn't imagine what you've gone through, so I appreciate you sharing that with us. Hopefully it provides us the perspective and the courage as well to tackle this problem as well. I represent a suburban district on Long Island. We're about 2,000 miles north of the southern border, but because of the country's open borders and my state's sanctuary city policies, New York State has too become a border state. But just this past week, I had the opportunity to visit the border down in El Paso to witness firsthand what is going on with the 1.2 million gotaways and the 100,000 fentanyl poisons that we've had over the past year. 1.2 million gotaways. That's more people than 8 different states. And the reality is our federal government has no idea where these people are. But what we do know is that 100,000 people died from fentanyl poisonings last year, and that's 250 per day, the equivalent of a commercial airliner crashing every day. And we know that that fentanyl is being made in China and being smuggled across the U.S.-Mexico border. And Sheriff Lamb, you noted that the impact of the border crisis isn't just in your state, isn't just in the United States border states, but across the United States. And in my home county of Suffolk, like I said, 2,000 miles north of the southern border, we saw recently we saw 400 deaths due to fentanyl poisoning. And I think that we all agree that more must be done to stop these illegal substances from entering our communities. So my question is to you, Sheriff, what resources do you need to find and seize the illegal drugs that are coming across our borders so that we can best fight this scourge that is killing so many Americans? And what impact, if any, in your opinion, would a wall or a fence or other physical barrier do to help you do your job, sir?
I'll answer the second thing first. The wall absolutely works. I mean, I have a wall around my house. It's not stopping anybody, but it's certainly deterring them from coming into my yard. It is a piece of border security. We got to put that together with the right amount of personnel, the right equipment. All of that works together to do it. My county will always have a problem because we have an Indian reservation that actually goes into Mexico. They won't build a wall there. So even in the good times, we still have people coming through. What we could do is continue to fund or increase the funding for Stone Garden. It gives us the ability to really help Border Patrol. And I would love to see a lot more equipment available for local law enforcement to be able to do it. For us, it's still going out and doing it the old-fashioned way, and that's traffic stops and getting people that are trying to be trafficked through the deserts, the cartels' activities through there.
Can you speak, Sheriff, at all to any of the technology that you could use to help do that job better, sir?
Absolutely, thank you, sir. I would love to have a drone that was a military-type drone because the expense, I need one that flies 50 to 100 miles that we can monitor our desert areas. Because within the desert areas south of my county is where the cartels are pushing people who have criminal records. I don't know if most people know, in the last year, I think it's the last year, even if it was 2 years, there's been over 40,000 people apprehended that had criminal convictions here in America for crimes and that they are also wanted by law enforcement. So think about the amount of people that are getting by us that we're not, that are actually criminals already.
And thank you for your dedication to this issue, Sheriff. It matters to your county, but it matters way north in my county as well. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Magaziner from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Chairman. And if you'll indulge me, this is my first time speaking on this committee, so I'm going to just speak for a moment at a high level. My hope is that this committee will work together on a bipartisan basis to enact smart policies to protect Americans against anyone who would do us harm, including by improving our security at our borders and points of entry. Everyone on this committee is going to have a decision to make, whether we are going to work together to get things done, or if we're here for partisan grandstanding. This committee, as I understand it, has a reputation for being one of the more bipartisan committees in Congress historically, where members do work across the aisle in the interest of protecting the safety of the American people, and I hope that that'll continue. That's one of the reasons that I chose to join this committee as a freshman. It's disappointing to me that already I hear not all, not most, but a few members using their time to take shots at the other side or the president or other political figures instead of having a productive conversation about solutions, and I hope that will not be the tone going forward. Because there are plenty of things that we can do to improve safety and security at the border that I think we can all agree on. We should all agree on securing the border and ports of entry by improving technology, by making sure there are adequate resources available, by finding ways to collaborate across agencies and with friendly nations to crack down on human trafficking, drug smuggling, and cartel activity, making the asylum process more efficient so that those who are doing the right thing and looking to do the process the right way don't run into a wall of unnecessary red tape and delays, and addressing the root causes of migration that are causing the vast majority of people to come here. We also have a real and pressing crisis with the opioid epidemic, and particularly fentanyl, that is ravaging our country, and we should attack that problem where it exists. I'm glad that there's been discussion today about the fact that over the last couple of years, more than 90% of fentanyl seizures have occurred at legal ports of entry, with American citizens, unfortunately, making up more than 80% of those apprehended. I don't say that to point fingers at anyone. I just say that to make sure that we focus our time and attention on where the problems are most severe so that we can save the most lives. So we need to do everything that we can to ensure that we stop fentanyl and other drug trafficking by employing the technology and the manpower where it's needed the most. And at the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that the vast majority of migrants who are coming here seeking entry to the United States at the southern border are doing so because they are fleeing violence and persecution. These are human beings who are running away from something in the vast majority of cases, and they deserve to be treated with humanity and respect. Those are our national values. So I hope as a committee we will endeavor to work together in a sober way to address these and the other challenges that our homeland faces. I hope that going forward we will not lose sight of the fact that the intelligence community has been clear that domestic extremism is one of our other most serious threats. Over the last 3 years, 80 Americans have been killed by violence motivated by domestic extremism, with white supremacy and anti-government extremism being among the most common motivating factors. That we need to redouble our efforts to strengthen our infrastructure and our cybersecurity. We just saw in the last few weeks reports of Vladimir Putin's regime attempting to shut down the electric grids and LNG facilities through cyber attacks in this country in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine a year ago. That is a sobering reminder of how much damage can be done to our country if we let our guard down. So this work is important. We owe it to the American people to focus on all of the threats to the homeland, including those at the southern border. And I look forward to working with my colleagues to do just that. Just expanding on the fentanyl crisis, Dr. Bier, I would ask you once again, in your judgment, where is the biggest source of the problem from a Homeland Security point of view, and what can we do as a committee on a bipartisan basis to stop the flow of these deadly substances into our country?
Well, the heart of the problem is at the ports of entry, and we know this from a lot of different lines of evidence. First of all, we have a very large sample size of people who've been interdicted crossing illegally, and those people are bringing hardly anything fentanyl-wise into the country. The other thing to look at is it's not that Border Patrol cannot interdict drug traffickers. For example, marijuana, 75% of marijuana arrests or seizures occur between ports of entry, and that's because the drug is too bulky in most cases to bring it through the ports. DEA's own investigations have found that it comes through ports of entry. They testified the vast majority come through legal ports of entry. And we also know, because the cartels themselves are telling us this, because they're warring over control of the ports of entry. They would not be fighting a war over the control of a port of entry if it was not the most valuable place for drugs to enter the country.
Gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Mr. McKean of Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Thank you for the impassioned plea to change a system that is leading to the death of hundreds of thousands of Americans. As we've talked about today, this is something that's impacting all of us. I've got a young adult that I was close to many years ago. He was actually a part of my church youth group, and I got word 2 weeks ago that he had, through an addiction, a sad addiction. I've not been around this young man for years. He had actually overdosed 2 weeks ago. And within, a text message exchange of condolences to his father, the father's response was, "Nobody should have to go through this." And so, Ms. Kiessling, nobody should have to go through what you're experiencing. In 2021, there were 299 fentanyl overdose deaths in my state of Oklahoma. In 2018, that figure was only 39, to your point earlier. That's a staggering, almost 700% increase. And we know it's attributed to what's happening at the southern border. Just this month, an illegal alien pled guilty for an illegal drug operation in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with 3,500 grams of fentanyl powder. 1,300 grams of fentanyl pills were discovered from his home. And that's enough to kill all the residents of Oklahoma City, 650,000 people. 2 weeks ago, a young man, as I described, that I was close to years ago, passed away. It hits home. In addition to that, in my district, in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, there was a 21-year-old named Zach Sanders experimenting with pills, took a pill laced with fentanyl, and he died of a drug overdose in January of 21. And after his death, his mother sponsored a billboard in that city, in Bartlesville, with a photo of Zach and the words that said, "Check your pills, fentanyl kills." What's happening is astounding. Bartlesville Police Department, the city had 12 overdose cases in 2021, and in just the first 10 months of 2022, they had 53 confirmed overdose cases. And we know by the national statistics, the majority of deaths, 18 to 45 years of age, is fentanyl, and the climb of overdoses in correlation to fentanyl. I'm going to hold up a graphic here. It's a penny, and Sheriff Lamb, this is a question to you. From what we know, it's 2 milligrams, which is demonstrated here, of fentanyl sized against the penny. That's technically a lethal dose, enough to kill. And we know that last year, 13,000 pounds of fentanyl was seized in 2023. That's enough to kill 333 million Americans 9 times over. So, Sheriff Lamb, my question to you is your estimation, describing to Ms. Kiessling's point, your children were thinking it's Percocet and ended up being fentanyl. What percentage of what you're seeing from your experience, boots on the ground, is coming from the cartel of this problem?
100%, sir. 100% is coming from the cartels. And this is also, the fentanyl, it doesn't take much at all. They're putting it in everything. They're putting it in the cocaine, the heroin, the marijuana. They're putting it in everything. And I wanted to mention the xylazine, and I hope I could take just 1 second.
Hey, it's a horse tranquilizer, right?
It's a horse tranquilizer.
I grew up in the horse industry. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about this.
It's not approved for human use. Here's what is alarming: it is a non-opioid, which means that naloxone and Narcan will be ineffective on it. The Phoenix Fire Department is starting to see it. Other states' departments are starting to see it. So the cartels are starting to add xylazine into the fentanyl, and it will be impervious to the Narcan or the naloxone that we often administer to each other and to other people who are suffering from a poisoning of fentanyl.
So the cartel's running the gamut. And so, as a colleague said earlier, you agreed that we need to see them as a terrorist organization. And in terms of seeing them as a terrorist organization, are they not the new form of organized crime in America, the new mob that we know as I was on the border last week, and right across from the suburbs of El Paso, that we're hearing about operational citywide control by the cartel? Why should we not be concerned that that is moving into America like the mob was able to take hold of control of areas in the United States?
Mr. Breckman, we should be concerned as Americans. That violence will spill over. It has spilled over, and it will continue to spill over into America. It'll affect American lives. I mean, the fentanyl already is. The DEA, I forgot to tell you, the DEA is now saying that 75% of the fentanyl doses they're finding are lethal doses. That's a staggering number, and it's going to affect a lot of American lives.
And then quickly, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Bier, do you think we have an invasion at our southern border?
There's certainly a problem at our southern border, yes.
Would you define it as an invasion?
No, not under our Constitution. Constitutionally, an invasion is a military action by a foreign government.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll just say Article 4, Section 4 guarantees to every state a Republican form of government and protect those states against an invasion. So the witness was very careful in knowing that I probably knew the Constitution and the way he answered that question.
And James Madison agrees with that definition as well. He wrote about what constitutes an invasion under our Constitution as well.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Garcia from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank our witnesses, all of them. Thank you very much for being here, especially Ms. Kiessling. I'm, of course, like everyone on the committee, I'm very sorry for your loss. I do want to start just my remarks by just making something just crystal clear. Democrats care about human trafficking and taking it on. We care about a safe and secure border. We agree that we need to prosecute and take on drug cartels. And we deeply care about the fentanyl crisis, which we know is happening. It's a serious issue taking on and really causing damage to communities across the country. But in listening to some of our colleagues here today, it's also pretty apparent that we also care about something that many of our Republican colleagues do not care about, and that's an orderly and humane immigration system. Now, I am an immigrant myself. I came to the U.S. As a young child, and I became a U.S. citizen in my early 20s. And I benefited from the last time our country actually passed an immigration reform system, which was actually over 35 years ago. And in fact, it was Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, who signed that bill that allowed me and my family to become U.S. citizens. So I appreciate that. I'm also a small group of members of Congress that are immigrants, and certainly on this committee. I like to say that becoming a U.S. citizen was the proudest day of my life. I know firsthand that immigrants like myself and like my mom, who cleaned houses and worked in clinics, cleaning clinics, are patriotic Americans. I consider myself an American patriot, and I also know that real patriotism, American patriotism, is actually about helping people. We also know that folks that are coming to our country are seeking help. Many are desperate. They're coming because in the tradition of America, this is a place where we afford the American dream to so many from across this world. And we are a nation of immigrants. And so these broad attacks that we're hearing today on immigrants today, I believe, is un-American. Immigrants are not all drug dealers, as some would suggest. And we also, as immigrants, agree that, of course, we need to secure our borders and have an orderly process at our border. And we want to work with our colleagues to also understand that our ports of entry are also places where fentanyl is clearly coming in huge numbers. But we also need to have conversations around drug treatment programs, mental health care, and access to care, none of which is happening today at this committee. And what I don't want to do is conflate asylum seekers with the flow of drugs. Mr. Bier, I want to thank you for your work that you've done on this topic, and I would ask you to remind us once again what the percentage is of all the folks that are arrested by Border Patrol possessing fentanyl. What is actually that percentage?
0.02%.
So not even 1%. Correct, sir?
Way less than 1%, less than 0.1%.
And I think that's an important point because you wouldn't know that by hearing from so many of my colleagues here, particularly on the other side of the aisle at this committee. And is it also true that 91% of drug seizures at checkpoints are from U.S. citizens?
That's right.
So contrary to the myth that is being, I think, proposed today by the chairman and so many others, a vast majority of the fentanyl entering the U.S. is actually by U.S. citizens at legal ports of entry. Is that not true?
That's right.
So, and Mr. Bier, consistent with your own research, I believe immigrants are also less likely to commit crimes in this country. Isn't that also true?
That's right. According to the Census Bureau, immigrants, both legal and illegal immigrants, are half as likely to end up behind bars and convicted of crimes in this country than U.S.-born residents.
And it's pretty clear that just listening to some of our colleagues today, you wouldn't know any of those facts to be true. All of that is actually true. It's documented. And I think it's important to continue to raise those, not just in this committee, but across the country. So thank you, sir. I want to note that the Biden administration has also fought for resources to increase a secure border. As we know this, to modernize our infrastructure, technology, support border agents, improve screening at our legal ports of entry. In fact, as we know, the infrastructure bill included $430 million for customs and border protection, of which most Republicans in Congress voted against. And so I think it's important that at this moment we work together to deploy these resources. And today I especially find it troubling that my colleagues are willing to discuss fentanyl at the border, but we don't have witnesses discussing all these treatment programs, drug addiction programs, or ways to help people that are suffering or that need mental health support. This conversation in front of us in this committee is broken and wrong. The American people are being misled by many members of this committee, and in the process are demonizing vulnerable people, including immigrants across this country. I hope we can work together to build a just and humane immigration system in our country, one that respects asylum seekers. I hope that we can get serious about addiction and universal health care. But unfortunately, those are not the conversations that we're having here today. I'm hopeful at the next committee, at the next meeting that we have, that we're not using this committee for political stunts and for misinformation. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields, and the chair recognizes Ms. Laura Lee from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and I appreciate each of our witnesses for being here with us today to discuss this important topic. Since President Biden took office, one simple fact has become clearer and clearer every day. Border security is national security. This is an issue that affects each one of our communities. It is an issue that is endangering our neighborhoods, our families, and our children. In my own community, authorities in Polk County recently confiscated 11 pounds of fentanyl. Following this drug bust, our Attorney General announced that authorities had seized enough fentanyl in just a few months to kill every single Floridian. Our responsibility here is very serious, and I appreciate you all sharing your insights with us today. Sheriff, I'd like to begin with you and return to the subject of your staff, your resources, and the effect this is having on your operation. As a former prosecutor and judge in Florida, I understand the very broad set of responsibilities that our local sheriffs have that include investigating all types of matters, everything from bank robberies to murders, rapes, and things that are happening in the community. Can you tell us, please, how this border crisis is diverting the resources that you have and the deputies that you have away from the other important functions that you are tasked with serving in your community?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Lee. And I just wanted to comment real quick that just because they're American citizens doesn't mean they're not correlated with the cartels and doing their work. The cartels do that on purpose so we can sit in here and make it an immigration issue when it's really about human trafficking and drug trafficking into America. And those people that come here are being victimized. We end up paying the price on the resource level. I have to dedicate my helicopter. We had 10 events yesterday alone where we worked with Border Patrol. One a 911 call. The other 9 of them were groups of people trying to come into this country illegally in camouflage clothes, carpet shoes. I have my 4 canine units dedicated completely to interdiction, catching drugs and people on the way in and money and guns on the way back to Mexico. I have an anti-smuggling unit. We have Stone Garden units. These are all units that should be dedicated to my community to continue to protect them. However, because the federal government is not getting the job done on the border, and this is no knock on our troops, the Border Patrol, ICE, they're phenomenal. They do their job, but they've become babysitters because of the amount of people coming in. And then we end up picking up the slack, and it has a tremendous impact on our resources.
And one thing that I want to be sure we share with the public here today, as a prosecutor, I worked on cases that involved human trafficking, the trafficking of women and children. And I'd like for you to share with us what you're seeing in your community around this horror of human trafficking.
Absolutely. We see every day. We can go out. My guys are out working today. We'll probably stop 3, 4, 5 vehicles piled with people, sometimes up to 15 to 20 people in a single vehicle that are being trafficked by the cartels, often being extorted because they couldn't pay the full amount at the border or being put into the sex trade. So yeah, these are the impacts that we're seeing, and we're seeing that number increase every day exponentially. And it's not okay as Americans to allow people to be put into the sex trade, whether it's women or children, and the cartel is doing it, and they're using American citizens to do it.
Thank you. Ms. Kiessling, I'd like to now take just a moment with you. As the mother of a school-aged child, I think it's very important that part of what we do today is share with parents your story. And if you would, what would you like to share with other parents, parents of school-aged children, about what happened to your sons and what you think our communities and our schools need to know about this crisis?
Starting with the problem with vaping in middle school, I went to the schools, and they're putting the drugs in vaping. It's not just nicotine, but they put things like Molly, all kinds of things go into the vaping, and these kids are getting it at a young age. That was their first addiction, and I did everything a parent should do. There weren't resources at the school. My friend, I mentioned her, my former law partner's husband's a sheriff deputy, he's a detective. He said when there's identity theft, they have a huge packet for everybody. They have stuff on the sheriff's website, everything you need to know how to restore your identity. There's nothing on fentanyl, there's nothing on Narcan, there's nothing that parents need to know. When I asked for resources, we had a sheriff deputy in the school every day. And again, this is top 5 school in the state of Michigan. And they said, well, there's a program you can take your kids to, the jail and have them visit. And that was it. I mean, there were no resources. I asked them for resources, for information for drug addiction. They had nothing. There was nothing for parents like me. And I tried. It's not for lack of trying. And my kids grew up, their birth mother was a drug addict. She died 6 months after them. Their uncle died a month after them. He was actually doing fentanyl on purpose. But my son had 5 times the amount of fentanyl in his system that was enough to kill. Again, this is not an overdose. This is poisoning. It's murder. It's homicide. Please use that language. Please don't say overdose. You need to have Narcan in your home. And the federal program that the state had for the money that they were getting from the federal government for rehab was not real rehab. It was just a flap house. We need real rehab.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your story. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Ms. Ramirez from Illinois.
Thank you, Chairman. We've heard a lot of fear-mongering and name-calling today. And I have to say, every time our undocumented community is referred to as illegals and criminals, it shows how my Republican colleagues choose to recognize or not recognize someone's basic humanity. And it's a choice. A policy choice with real consequences. As the only member of Congress in a mixed status family, you are saying that my family, my husband and I, should be broken apart. Today's hearing is called Every State is a Border State. And it's clear that the intention is to stake fear and hate. I am proud to represent the people of Illinois, 3rd Congressional District, all people regardless of their status. 12 million of our neighbors are still lacking legal status, and they're facing deportation right now. To be absolutely clear, and I want to make sure it's on the record, We need humane, comprehensive immigration reform, and we need it now. We need to uphold the right to asylum. And in the meantime, we need protections in place against deportation, and we need work permits issued for all 12 million people. Mr. Bier, there are approximately 600,000 DACA recipients. They pay $6.2 billion in federal taxes and $3.3 billion in state and local taxes every single year. DACA recipients, like my husband Boris, aren't children anymore. Many of them are parents themselves, they're homeowners, they're teachers, they are childcare workers, they work in our hospitals. These numbers don't even count the many undocumented immigrants who are not DACA recipients, who pay payroll taxes, who pay into Social Security, but can't claim the benefits themselves. I strongly support protecting and expanding Social Security. And at a time when some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would even consider cutting Social Security, what are the consequences of deportations on our country's ability to keep Social Security solvent?
Look, the Social Security Administration estimates that we have a shortfall of about 70 million people that we will need by 2050 to keep payments in line with the revenues that they're receiving. So deporting 10 million people would certainly not be in the interest of maintaining Social Security payments. Obviously, people who are in this country are paying taxes. You mentioned the payroll taxes. The vast majority of these people are working through borrowed identification or other means by which they ultimately do pay taxes. So it's not the case that all people who are working under the table, that's not how it happens in most cases.
Thank you. So let's talk about the border. For those of you that know me, know my story well, my mother crossed the border 39 years ago, pregnant of me. If it weren't because she crossed the border, escaping poverty, nearly dying, escaping rape, and all the things that she experienced, this woman here wouldn't be the first Latina in the Midwest in Congress. So first, I want to say thank you to all of the people who courageously risk everything so that they can escape poverty and save their lives, coming to a place where we call America that we love so much. Many immigrants arriving at the southwest border are fleeing dire situations right now. And they're making that journey through jungles and through deserts to the border extremely vulnerable. Recently, the administration proposed a rule limiting migrants' eligibility to apply for asylum with CBP's One app. Now, let me ask you, if they traveled through another country before arriving to the US border and did not seek asylum first, like a similar measure that was attempted with the Trump administration and the courts didn't allow, what would happen to an asylum seeker who did not have access to a smartphone or couldn't use the CBP One app application?
Well, if they cross the border illegally, because that would be their only other option, then they would be removed. The administration is talking about removing people to Mexico again, possibly removing people to their home country if they can. In either case, what we've seen under Remain in Mexico in Title 42 is that when you ban asylum and you send people back to Mexico, they recross the border illegally, it creates a more dangerous and less secure border. We keep hearing about these evasions. Well, if people can request asylum and enter this country legally, then we do not have this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Bier. I would just end in saying that we have to stop criminalizing people and we have to get to the root cause of the problems. That's what I intend to do as committee. I yield back, Chairman.
The gentlelady yields, and I now recognize Mr. D'Esposito of New York.
Thank you, Chairman. First, I want to comment that this past weekend, we made a trip with the Homeland Security Committee. This was my second trip to the border. And at no point in speaking to local business owners, at no point in speaking to educators, in no point in speaking to farmers or law enforcement, at no point did they ask what party we were from. So the claims of my colleagues from the other side that we are politicizing this is absolutely ridiculous. The fact of the matter is that we want to give people the opportunity for the American dream, but we want them to come through the front door, and we want to do it the right way. The Biden border crisis is more than illegal immigration. Criminals, weapons, illegal narcotics are coming across the border in alarming numbers. In fact, the vast majority, 74%, of MS-13 members that the Department of Justice have prosecuted from 2016 to 2020 were unlawfully present. Sadly, Long Island is all too familiar with the destruction of violent gangs like MS-13. Just last month, an MS-13 member pled guilty for the murder of an 18-year-old in Cal Meadow Park in my district in March of 21, and the attempted murder of a Nassau County Police Department detective. Sheriff Lamb, I want to first thank you for your service. As a former NYPD detective, I committed, like you, my career to keeping our streets safe. And I know the value of every single layer and level of law enforcement. Can you talk about the differences between your relationship now with the federal government during the current Biden administration versus the last administration?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. De-Esposito, and thank you for your service as well. Night and day difference. Night and day difference. We always have a great working relationship with Border Patrol, ICE agents, but it stops outside of the state of Arizona. As a sheriff, I went to the White House 10 times under the last administration, not for political reasons, but to address these same issues. We felt like we had a seat at the table. We no longer feel like we have a seat at that table.
Thank you. And in what ways do you believe our country's current border policies incentivize gangs and other criminals to enter this country? Specifically, the cartel and their involvement.
We can talk politics all day, but when we asked people why they came here, they said because Joe Biden said we could. And this is the reality of what we deal with every day. So clearly the policies that have been, whether you call them open borders or not, they are affecting people coming here, and the cartels are taking advantage and marketing to people in other countries to come. And by default, our lack of policies or weak border security is actually bringing those people to the doorsteps of the cartels to be enslaved, to be taken advantage of. And like Ms. Garcia mentioned, these are good people, many of them, but they're being taken advantage of by the cartels that our policies have encouraged.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you again for your service. As you know, New York City Mayor Eric Adams had to beg for federal assistance for putting arriving aliens in hotels and building makeshift shelters throughout the 5 boroughs. At a rate of $65,116 per individual, our mayor estimates that New York City taxpayers will need to spend $2.8 billion with a B, in the next fiscal year to deal with the rapid influx. Doctor, according to your testimony, as CEO of the Yuma Regional Medical Center, your hospital has seen a massive influx of migrants seeking care starting in the fall of 2021. It's similar to the educators that we spoke to across the border, and quite frankly, the ones that I'm talking to across Long Island that are having budget shortfalls because they don't budget for the new individuals coming to the school in the school year. How many of these migrants have no way to pay for the care provided in your facilities? And can you speak to the true cost of Joe Biden's border crisis on the American economy?
We've not received any compensation for any of the migrants that we've provided care to. The border policy has been significant for us. As I said, Yuma's got a population of 100,000 people. We've had 300,000 people cross the border, and we're the only hospital they can come to. All that care provided to them is for free. It impacts our organization significantly. Those are dollars we would normally put back into the community, put back into resources to serve additional folks.
Well, Doctor, I guess you would probably agree it's not free. We're paying for it. It's definitely not free.
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Goldman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sheriff Lamb, do you believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election?
Well, Joe Biden's the president now.
No, what do you believe?
I believe that he lost the election. I mean, there's questions about how our election integrity, I don't know how that relates to Homeland Security, but I have questions, and I think
you don't know how election integrity relates to Homeland Security? Is that your testimony?
My testimony is it does relate because we're seeing how bad it's been under the last 2 years. So yes, it has a correlation. However,
election integrity?
What's that?
You said you don't believe election integrity relates to Homeland Security. Is that your testimony?
Well, I don't know how this election, the question of whether I think the last president won or lost, it is about this today. Election integrity absolutely matters.
Okay.
And I believe that there are a lot of Americans that have questions about election integrity. and my job is to make sure that we ensure that we have safe and secure elections.
Do you believe that there was fraud in the 2020 election?
There's always fraud in every election.
Really?
There's significant, however many people it is, there are people that vote for people that are no longer, that are deceased. There are people that vote when they don't live in a certain residence.
You're right. So let me ask you this question. Do you think that there was fraud that had a material impact on the results of the 2020 election?
As a law enforcement official, I have seen zero evidence that would show me otherwise.
Right. Do you believe that those people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th were, quote, very loving Christian people, unquote?
I think that there were a lot of good people there that were exercising their First Amendment right, and I think they have, in many ways, been lumped in with a group of people that had bad intentions.
Okay. So you would agree that not everyone at the Capitol on January 6th would be considered a loving person?
I agree that there were people that violated the law, and I think those people are being held accountable.
Okay, because you have been quoted as saying that the rioters who were there on January 6th were very loving Christian people. Did you see the videos of that day on January 6th?
Yes, sir. I've seen a lot of videos where there were a lot of good people that were not rioting, and you're saying that the rioters, that's different than the people who were coming and exercising their First Amendment rights.
So you don't
people had
support,
every right to exercise their First Amendment
you
rights.
don't support the rioters who beat the police and invaded the Capitol, is that right?
Absolutely not. I am a rule of law guy, and if you broke the law, you should be held accountable.
So do you support then the 950 prosecutions that the Department of Justice has brought arising out of the events of that day?
Well, I know nothing of those 950 prosecutions. I wasn't there for them. I don't know the details of those cases. So for me to come and say that I support every one would be a little bit naive because I don't have the information.
Sure. Do you support the 10 convictions that the DOJ has obtained for seditious conspiracy?
I am unaware of the 10 convictions, nor do I know anything about those cases.
Really? Because they involve the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. Are you familiar with those?
I am aware of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers.
Have you ever interacted with them or spent any time with them?
I know what you're alluding to. I went to a 2A rally and had some people come shake my hand who somebody says they're Proud Boys. They had no indication of that, so.
Did you host a rally for your future Senate run where there were Oath Keepers and Proud Boys there?
No, I did not host a rally. There was a 2A rally where I mentioned that I was strongly considering a Senate run, where I have now learned that there were some Proud Boys there.
Would you agree with me that seditious conspiracy is a conspiracy to overthrow the government through violence?
I'm not sure what the code says exactly, but that sounds pretty familiar.
Okay. And would you agree that the violent overthrow of our government is a threat to our national security?
Absolutely.
Okay. I asked that question because you've been on record as questioning many things about the 2020 election, many things about the January 6th events, and you just said that election integrity is not directly related to the subject of our hearing today, which is our Homeland Security. And I'm happy to hear that you agree with me that the conspiring to overthrow our government, as members of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers were convicted of, is a threat to our Homeland Security and is a threat to our national security. Last question. Do you think that the Mexican drug cartels were created in 2020?
No.
They've been around for a long time,
Yes.
haven't they? Okay. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and the chair recognizes Mr. Ezell from Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss how the Biden administration's failure to secure the border affects not just the states along the southern border, but also spreads through communities in Mississippi and across our nation. Sheriff Lamb, first I want to thank you for your service and your willingness to testify today. As a former sheriff, I applaud the work that your deputies and yourself are doing, and I know the increase in drug seizures has been great and a big burden upon you. However, as we both know, the more illicit drugs that are caught, the more we are missing. Based on your experience, how have the drug trafficking networks expanded their operations since 2020?
They've expanded their operations tremendously. As we heard earlier, one of the members mentioned they were making about $500 million a year. They are now making about $13 billion a year. And they're doing it large in part on taking advantage of these people that are trying to come make a better life for themselves. They are paying cash up front, which is only emboldening the cartels and giving them a lot of money on hand to be able to buy weapons and increase their footprint along our southern border.
Thank you. What action should the federal government take to stop the flow of illegal drugs into our communities?
We should secure our southern border. That includes continuing building the wall where it hasn't been built, increasing the amount of Border Patrol agents we have, increasing technology, turning on the technology that is there that has not been turned on for political reasons. These are all things that need to happen so that we can continue to get back to securing our border and helping these people who are being trafficked and the drugs from killing American lives.
Thank you for that. Unfortunately, fentanyl poisonings continue to surge. In a single year, fentanyl deaths more than doubled in my home state of Mississippi. In your testimony, you call the I-10 corridor that runs straight through my district, and I'd like to hold up this photo of an I-10 seizure in Jackson County, Mississippi, which is over 1,000 miles away from the southern border. Here you can see 29 pounds of mixed heroin and fentanyl, which was found in a single traffic stop. Clearly, border counties are not the only ones affected by this crisis. Does your department have the resources it needs to handle the surges in smuggling and traffic incidents?
No, sir, we do not have the resources. We do the best we can with what we have. We're proud of what we do stop, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
When you come in contact with a human drug smuggler, how does your department determine where these criminals are heading?
Through a series of questioning, we have a lot of guys that are very skilled at what they do in interdiction, recognizing things that don't line up in their statements, and then we start to work that back and figure out where it came from. A lot of them, as you can imagine, don't like to talk to us and don't like to tell the truth, but we do the best we can to find out where they came from.
One problem that we had in Jackson County, which is still a problem, if we end up taking one of these folks that we've arrested to the hospital, do you have to spend resources and manpower on sitting on that person that's in the hospital?
Mr. Ezel, yes, in the case that they committed a crime, let's say they ran from us and we pursued them, there was a crime, we would have to sit on them until we could book them in. In a case where there was no crime committed, we would not have to go sit with them. They would be turned over to Border Patrol, and Border Patrol would likely take that.
But that would take a man off of his duties on patrol and have to sit in the hospital.
Yes, sir, it would.
Well, thank you for your answer. The Biden administration has allowed the crisis at the border to persist, and as we have shown today, every state is a border state. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes Ms. Clark from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our ranking member, thank our witnesses for their testimony here today. The mission of the Homeland enterprise is vast and complex. It's important for the success of the Homeland mission that we focus on the challenges of law enforcement in the midst of an urgent migrant crisis and the conflation of the opioid and fentanyl crisis with asylum seeking is quite unfortunate. It distracts from the real work of surging resources and personnel required to win against drug cartels and drug dealers. As the daughter of immigrants, I find it extremely distasteful to sit here and look at how we've used the plight of our fellow Americans to exploit what is clearly xenophobia. Ms. Kiessling, I am deeply sorry for your loss. But I know that with the proper resources dedicated to drug programs, drug rehabilitation, education, some of the things that you mentioned to some of my colleagues that you did not have access to in your child's high school, we could save many more lives. And I hope that you'll become a more vocal advocate for delivering those resources to your community, because I'll stand shoulder to shoulder with you in making those resources available. And Dr. Trenschel, you have a hospital that could do great work in that space. I hope you too will become an advocate for the type of treatment that our nation needs to get past what has been a decades-long addiction crisis. Our decades-long broken immigration system needs reform. I'm hopeful that when we clear the air of the smoke that has been, the smoke screen that's been erected by those who would use our crisis of addiction to demonize those migrants who have risked life and limb seeking safety and freedom in one of the greatest nations in the world, that we will get down to the business of a 21st century immigration system in the United States of America. Mr. Bier, you mentioned that immigrants to be key contributors to our economy, and having a restrictive immigration system only leads to millions of people who want to contribute their skills and hard work to do so illegally, which leads to violations of the law. How can we ensure that immigrants, who are big contributors to the American economy, can have lawful pathways while they are awaiting legal status without the fear of being ripped away overnight and sent back to the dangerous conditions from which they've escaped?
We have to start by looking at what's causing people to come to the border. Of course, when you look at Cuba and Venezuela, these are socialist governments that have destroyed their economies and trapped people in poverty for many years now. Nicaragua is going in an authoritarian way. We've seen what's happening in Central America with the violence and crime there. Mexico, we hear all the testimony about the cartels and the violence that is occurring. People are coming because they're being driven out, not because they really want to leave their homes. And so we need processes and procedures that allow them to apply to come legally. And that will free up resources for law enforcement to come. We've already seen successful programs to do this, whether it be the Ukrainian program we talked about earlier, or the programs for Venezuela and these other countries that were just rolled out in January, saw a massive drop in people arriving. That's because people know if they can apply legally, if there's a viable shot, they will go the legal route because of all of the risks coming illegally to this country.
Thank you very much, and not to mention Haiti.
Of course, right, I'm sorry for...
With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from the great state of Alabama, Mr. Strong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the witnesses, I thank each of you for joining us here today. As my colleagues mentioned, last weekend, several of us were able to make a trip to the southern border and witness firsthand this administration's border crisis. This trip confirmed what we already knew to be true: our southern border is in crisis. It's hard to imagine anyone could reach a different conclusion. The impacts are felt all around the country. My district specifically has seen a drastic rise in the number of fentanyl-related deaths. We're also seeing more drugs on the streets, which many local law enforcement officers attribute to the Mexican cartels and this administration's immigration policies. I've spent almost 4 decades as a firefighter, emergency medical technician, and have personally worked over 100 overdoses. I believe it's no coincidence that the last 2 years have seen a drastic uptick in these calls. I have several photos here to share with you today. Each of these are from drug busts in Madison County, Alabama, within the last 6 months. I'm proud of the tireless work of the law enforcement officials to get these drugs off the streets of our community. These 3 pictures alone amount to enough fentanyl to kill the entire population of Alabama. This is from only 2 seizures in Madison County, each of which originated in Mexico. You will notice that in these pictures, stacked team badge number 12, that right there is Officer Billy Clardy's badge. He went to Sparkman High School. We went to school together. He was killed in Huntsville, Alabama on December the 6th, 2019, working to protect North Alabama from these drugs and was killed by a drug dealer. This issue is not a Republican issue. It is not a Democratic issue. It's an American issue. North, South, East, West, rich, poor, black, white, Latino, Indian. Drugs do not discriminate. Every family has been affected one way or the other. Fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, human smuggling is rampant at the southern border. No American is safe. Ms. Kiessling, I'm sorry for the circumstances that have brought you to this United States, to this hearing. No parent should have to experience what you have. As a father, my heart goes out to you. You may have seen reports that a province in Canada will decriminalize possession of several drugs, including heroin, morphine, fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine, and MDMA. Do you think this is the right approach to take?
In Oregon, they've been legalizing or decriminalizing a bunch of different drugs. Fentanyl is not something that you can just control like that. Fentanyl is used for anesthesia and surgeries. You know, you have to have an anesthesiologist present to make sure someone doesn't die. Okay, were we going to have a country full of anesthesiologists provided for all of them? I heard him say, "Oh, let's make fentanyl strips available." You know, so many of the children that are dying are young. They have no knowledge of anything like this. You think the drug dealers they're trying to kill off our children. The reason why they're adding this new drug in, the sedative for tranquilizer for horses, is because they don't want them to be saved by Narcan. They're trying to kill off our population. This is a war.
Thank you. You mentioned that drugs were indeed from Mexico. Does it make you feel better to hear this administration says there's no crisis at the southern border?
That's complete ignorance. That's absolutely clueless to say something like that.
Thank you. Sheriff Lamb, thank you for being before us. I've had an opportunity to meet you once before. In your testimony, you highlighted the importance of local law enforcement in dealing with the crisis at the border. Over the last several years, some of my colleagues across the aisle have called to defund law enforcement and police. What would that mean for local efforts at the border if law enforcement agencies did not receive, if they were to start cutting funding?
That's a great question, sir. And if you cut out the local funding, it would be even worse of a problem. A lot of the stops you're seeing, a lot of the drug busts are happening on a local level because it's getting through the borders. So even though they say 90% is happening at the checkpoints, in Arizona it's 52 and 48%.
You got it.
So the majority of ours is, half of it is still coming through between the checkpoints.
Thank you. Dr. Trenschel, as you are well aware, we have an opioid crisis in the United States, particularly with fentanyl's rise in popularity. Prior to the border crisis, how often would you say that you have treated patients for fentanyl poisoning?
It's definitely gone up since the borders were opened. I don't have those specific numbers, but it's definitely an increase.
Thank you. Within the last 2 years, have you experienced an increase in treating patients with fentanyl poisoning?
Yes, we have.
Could you please describe what the treatment for fentanyl poisoning entails
The gentleman's
and the average
time
cost
has
to
expired.
Thank you,
We're gonna
Mr.
need to
Chairman.
move on. I now recognize Ms. Titus from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we've heard a lot about fentanyl, which is tragic, certainly. Everybody agrees with that. And also other illegal drugs brought by criminals, brought by drug dealers, brought by cartels. This is a crisis at the border. But I want to go back to something Mr. Swalwell brought up a little bit, just for emphasis. I'd like to remind this hearing and these folks who are here that when this came up for us to consider putting more resources into fighting this drug carrying over the southern border, there were all but two Republicans who are currently serving in this Congress voted against the appropriations bill. All but two voted against it. Now, that appropriations bill had critical provisions to help DHS manage the border. It included $400 million for inspection systems to detect drugs. I'd like to hear from those people who think this is such a big problem, why they didn't vote for the resources to go after it, so we wouldn't have tragedies like the deaths from fentanyl. We wouldn't have the cartels coming over here. We wouldn't have the crisis at the border. We would be doing something about it. But no, only 2 Republicans voted for those resources in the appropriations bill to deal with these questions, these problems, these crises that you all have mentioned and harped on throughout this hearing. I'd like to change the subject just a little bit to talk about the immigrant communities in this country. I live in Las Vegas. It's an international city. People from all over the world come there, and people from all over the world live there. We have growing populations from Asia as well as from Latin America. They work back of the house, front of the house, gardening. They are contributing members to the community. And I have a lot of mixed status families. You will have one person who is a citizen, one person who is a dreamer, one person on TPS, and one person who may not even know what their status is. But they are all contributing to the economy. Mr. Bier, would you talk a little bit about some of the ways, positive ways, that immigrants who come here do make contributions to our economy, to our culture, to our society in general?
Of course. I mentioned $250 billion in state and local tax revenues that are paid by these people. They work at higher rates. They are employed in occupations that actually create jobs for other U.S. workers. So if you look at a restaurant, you'll see the immigrants. A lot of times they'll be working in the back of the restaurant, creating jobs for Americans in the front of the restaurant. The same thing goes on across the entire economy. These people are contributors. They're expanding the economy by trillions of dollars every year. That's helping bring down the cost of goods and services, because the more our economy grows, the more items are available on the shelves of every store in America. And that's a benefit directly to Americans.
I just met with the National Franchise Association and the Latin Chamber in Las Vegas. And we were talking about how franchises often help people become more prosperous and contribute to the community because they fund the little league teams and things like that. Most of the franchises in Las Vegas have been opened in the last several years by immigrants, women. Immigrant women are going into small businesses and building those numbers just as you see.
And we know that immigrants are twice as likely to be entrepreneurs than U.S.-born residents. It's part of their culture, right? If you're willing to get up and be entrepreneurial enough to come and change what country you're living in, you are willing to take another risk to start a business and contribute in that way, which also benefits consumers by having another option available to them.
Could you mention briefly, you said it before, but about the guest worker programs that could go all year that might be helpful to areas dependent on tourism like Las Vegas?
Oh, absolutely. So we have 2 seasonal guest worker programs for non-agricultural and agricultural, but you cannot get a guest worker visa for industries like dairy and livestock that are year-round and have a need throughout the season. Of course, also in Las Vegas, you're dealing with tourism. Again, they're ineligible for these visas because of the fact that you have to show it's a seasonal nature, a temporary job. And so that restriction is ultimately creating this process why people come over to fill those jobs. They're coming in illegally because there's not a legal option available to them.
It's no longer just a season in Las Vegas. It's a year-round.
Yes, absolutely. And it's, the growth of tourism industry in many places, desperate for workers. And you're seeing, I've seen it, I'm sure every member of this committee has seen it, the decline in service as a result of the worker shortage throughout the country.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. Without objection, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Ciscomani, is permitted to sit on this panel and ask questions of the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my fellow members of the committee for allowing me to waive onto this committee as a guest, to have the opportunity to discuss such an important issue to my community. I want to thank the panel as well for taking the time to be here with us. A little background, I was born in Mexico. I'm an immigrant myself. First time I was in Capitol Hill was in 2003 as an intern, and I still had a green card at that time as an adult. I'm back now 20 years later as a member of Congress. Only in America can we have these kind of opportunities. This is the land of opportunity, and like Mr. Garcia and Mrs. Ramirez, we enjoy the opportunities this country offered us and our parents. And that's why I'm so proud to be here, so proud to be an American, and so proud to be an immigrant as well, serving in Congress today. I really believe that we can have a conversation about immigration and about border security. I care about both. I've lived both, obviously, being an immigrant and also living in the border community. And today, I think it's important to focus the issue on what we're talking about. In my case, in my question for the sheriff, thank you for being here, Sheriff Lamb, and I appreciate your time and making the trip up here. It's always good to see you at home, but always nice to see you here as well. It's around the area that we've been discussing around fentanyl. And in Arizona, fentanyl trafficking has taken its toll on our communities. More than 8,600 pounds of fentanyl have been seized along the southwest border in our first 4 months in this fiscal year. This is enough to kill more than 1.9 million people. Could you speak on the impact that this has on our young children and those who are true victims? And I want to take the chance real quick to, ma'am, offer you my deepest condolences. I'm a dad of 6, 3 boys and 3 girls. I can't imagine the pain that you've gone through, and I thank you for your bravery and being here. I've actually spoken to 2 different mothers this last week that have lost their children to this tragic crisis. Sheriff, would you mind speaking on the fentanyl issue, please?
Yes, sir. Thank you. It's always great seeing you too, Mr. Siscomani. Yeah, the fentanyl is the leading cause of death, not just amongst Americans between the ages of 18 and 45. It is the leading cause of death amongst children in Arizona. 44 children in 2021 died from fentanyl poisonings. 7 were under the age of 1, 2 were under the age of 5. Those are some staggering statistics. In my county, we've had we are at 73 in 2021 people that were poisoned, not just children. And now the number is currently sitting at 61 until we get all the numbers back in from the medical examiner. We will exceed that 73 as well. So it's a big problem for our children. Here's the key point, and it's been mentioned earlier. It is a 100% preventable. In our jail, I do a ton of reentry programs. I help people with mental health addiction, drug addiction. We work tirelessly because inevitably the sheriff's office, we are your de facto mental health institutes, and we have to deal with more addiction issues than most people do. And so we work hard to try to stop it, but it is affecting our children.
Thank you, Sheriff. And I'll take one more question. I want to be respectful of the time. Right on the I-10 that goes through your entire county, I call that, and many others too, the artery of our state for trade, for commerce, for transportation between the 2 major cities in the state, also for trafficking. And one of the things that we've been seeing is an increase in high-speed chases in this area, many that are starting in Cochise County and then go through Pima County and also Pinal County, where lives are being lost, not only of bystanders and innocent drivers, but also of those being trafficked in these infamous rollovers that we're seeing an increase on. Would you mind touching on that as well, please?
Absolutely. One of the statistics we had is 461% increase in the last 2 years for pursuits involving human trafficking. A lot of times these are kids driving, so they run and they have 10 people in their car. A lot of times they'll lose control of the vehicle, causing the injury and death to not just themselves sometimes or innocent citizens, but also to those people that are just trying to come here to make a better life. They become the victims of this as well.
Thank you, Sheriff. Again, thank you to the panel, and thank you to my colleagues. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes Mr. Garbarino from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for having this hearing, and to all of our witnesses who have been here for quite a long time today. We really appreciate it, but this just shows, I think, I've been here, this is my 3rd year here, and this is probably one of the best attended hearings from members with all the questions, so I think you can all understand how important this issue is. I'm from New York, as you heard, Long Island, and as we've heard today, that fentanyl does not discriminate. No family, no community, no region is safe from the threats presented by trafficking of fentanyl across the border. In 2021, Suffolk County, where I'm from, lost 425 residents to overdoses from opioid pain relievers, including fentanyl. New York State Health Commissioner reported last year that 3/4 of all overdose deaths in New York state now involve fentanyl. Sheriff Lamb, you mentioned in your testimony the number of fentanyl pills seized by your deputies increased by 610% since 2020. I know you just, my colleague, you just answered a couple of questions about what your deputies are doing. Can you get a little more involved into what some of the technologies your team has found useful in detecting these pills that the cartels are bringing over?
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. There is a lot of technology you can use that will test the density of the vehicle to be able to see if they're packing it inside the vehicles. But a lot of this stuff is very rudimental. We had a vehicle that we stopped that had 3 trays of food in it. Our deputies were searching the car, moved one of the trays. It was heavier than it probably should have been. They stuck a stick inside the tray. It only went down about this deep and a tray this deep. So then they scraped the food back only to find 3 trays had 227,000 fentanyl pills in those trays of food. We also stopped a car that had a driver. The passenger in the front seat was dressed as a nun. She had a veil over her face. She had a Bible on her lap. Our investigation ended up revealing that she had 8 pounds of granular fentanyl, which would kill millions of people, underneath her dress in that traffic stop. They will use every tactic they can.
So what do you need from us? What kind of tools can we send you?
Well, I'm a big states' rights guy. I would love for the government to back off and let the states do our deal. But we would love.
But I mean, if we could send you some technology or some, some actual, what technology could we do? Not rules, not mandates, but what could we give you? What could Congress send you that would help you do your job?
And sir, I appreciate you asking that. I would love. We could use drones. We could use some of these. I'm not sure the thermal machines that actually read the thermal of the vehicle. Honestly, we could just use more funding for resources, getting our guys out on the streets. A lot of this is stopped, just like I mentioned earlier, with good old-fashioned police work, and the guys not willing to give up.
I appreciate that. I'm not sure if the clock started, but I guess
I think it started. Yeah, I think your time is up.
I'll yield back. Thank you.
All right. The gentleman yields, and I think the ranking member wanted to add something to the record, so I now recognize Mr. Thompson for the purpose of placing something into the record.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to submit statements from the First Focus Campaign for Children, Human Rights First, and Coalition for Human Immigrant Rights.
So ordered. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Ranking Member. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. This concludes our first full hearing in this Congress. I want to thank the members for their time and their congeniality through most of this. We have differences of opinion, very clearly, but I think everyone wants what's best for our country. To our witnesses, Ms. Kiessling, thank you for sharing your heart and the tragedy that occurred to you. Sheriff, the challenges you're facing, I appreciate your time today. Dr. Trenschel, really appreciate you. We spent probably more of the time, and appropriately so, on the human costs. But as we go forward throughout this Congress, there'll be more opportunities to delve into the financial costs of what's going on as well. Mr. Bier, I appreciate you, and I appreciate your passion. Thanks for being here. We've heard a lot today that the crisis is due to a lack of resources. Before I close, I want to make the point that, the budget didn't decrease in January 21. The number of people on the border didn't decrease on January 21. But a massive surge of people came across our border then. What changed was the removal of some significant policies that had been shown to work. And I think it's very important to stress that. I think resources are needed, and I agree with the comments from both sides of the aisle on that issue. But I want to stress the massive wave, 4.7 million, 1.2 million gotaways, more than the past 2 administrations combined, didn't happen because we cut the budget or we cut the people. It happened because the president cut the policies. And with that, we will stand adjourned. What we're going to do, before I adjourn us, we're going to take a 15-minute break. We have to reset for the votes on the oversight plan. It looks like votes on the floor are delaying a little bit, so we'll be able to knock that out. So for this hearing today, again, thank our witnesses, thank our members. We stand adjourned.
Mm-hmm.